Welcome, everybody, to Defending the Biblical Roots of Christianity. And today we have an exciting guest. Now, his name may not be familiar to you yet, but we're going to hear a lot of very interesting things from a friend from across the pond. We'll be talking with Mr. Rubén Goméz, who has written a book that we'll be talking about today called Hebrew Roots. Very interesting to kind of get a global view of what we have going on. And we're going to dig into this book because this is a great resource. And full disclosure, he asked me to write the foreword. Ruben and I have known each other for a little while now. And I was honored to do so because this is a beautiful, systematic kind of breakdown of a lot of the questions I get from you guys, from you viewers. He covers quite well in this book. So I'll be excited to go through this with him. So as usual, I'm just going to let our guest do most of his self-introduction. So let's pull on from beautiful off the coast of Spain in a beautiful island called Menorca. Is that right?
It is.
Yeah, right. Rubén Goméz, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited. So for those of you watching, I guess just a quick little background. Ruben and I crossed paths maybe, I think it was 2 years ago, maybe. But it was because of Hebrew Roots, and he had come across my book, I believe, and reached out to me, and we got on, I forgot where it was, Facebook or wherever, and had a video chat for a while and kind of shared what we're each experiencing. So it's really cool to meet another brother who's kind of in the same area of apologetics. And so, as I mentioned, he's written a book. But before we get into that, Ruben, tell us a little bit about your personal and professional background. Like what led you to write this book and where you are today?
Sure. I'm a Spanish Baptist minister. And I have been for many, many years. But I've been translating academic Christian books and doing my own writing for the better part of the last 25 years. So that's what I do.
Okay.
I hold a master's degree from the University of Chester, a master's degree in theology. And my training and research lies mainly in the area of hermeneutics and Jewish-Christian relations.
Great.
So apart from that, my wife of 39 years and I have 3 grown-up children and 1 grandchild. And we are expecting a second one next month, God willing.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you.
That's great. We're not quite to the grandchildren stage yet. We've got our oldest is about to get married this year. So,
okay.
Beautiful time of life.
Yeah, great experience.
So, so how did you first come across Hebrew Roots? What was your first exposure to this theology?
Actually, it happened in a interesting kind of way. I was doing some research, in-depth research about the Messianic Jewish movement as part of my studies and so on. And I realized that there were many so-called Messianic Gentiles who worshipped in Messianic Jewish congregations, right, or who had been a part of Messianic Jewish congregations at some point in their lives. I felt that was interesting, and so I wanted to know who were these people, why they identified as Israelites, and also what led them to conclude that we should, as believers, be keeping Torah. So once they piqued my interest, I guess I just decided to follow the rabbit trail. And see where it led.
Your academic curiosity got the better of you.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
So that's how it all started.
That's very interesting. I came at it through a friend, but I had the equal experience of, wait, this is really curious and interesting. What's going on here? And I wanted to kind of lean in.
Yes.
So in your part of the world, in Europe, what is the state of Hebrew Roots? What are you seeing? Is it very active? Is it well known?
It is, because with the advent of the internet and social media, it has become a global phenomenon. So it doesn't really matter where you live. You've probably encountered or will encounter at some point the Hebrew roots movement in one way, shape, or form.
Sure.
So I would say that probably you have more groups under the umbrella of what we would call the Hebrew roots movement, Torahism, Torah-observant Christians, or whatever.
Sure.
But I would say that in the American continent, it is probably more widespread. But it is also well known in Europe. And as I said, being a globalized world, no matter where you are, you will encounter that phenomenon. And
Right.
that's basically, what also drove me to write about Hebrew roots. Its growth, its challenges, the challenges it poses on traditional so-called Christianity.
Yeah, yeah, that's very interesting. So I mentioned to you off air that I have had many conversations with pastors who will reach out and want to chat on the phone because they're unaware of this movement until it kind of rises up in their church, and either people are leaving the church or challenging them, or getting really curious about this. Have you seen it infiltrate or affect the church in
Well,
Spain?
in Spain, where I live, there's one of the largest denominations, evangelical denominations, is ethnically gypsy. We call it the Gypsy Church. Philadelphia is actually the name,
Okay.
and for some reason they are the ones who have come under a lot of pressure because many people from Hebrew roots have been trying to pull them away from their churches. So
Okay.
I would say that's the only denomination as such that has been greatly affected here in Spain. Others may have occasionally come across some influences, but not
Sure.
in a general kind of way as
So that's super interesting. Is there a connection in the Gypsy Church with the concept of the lost tribes of Israel? That kind of a thing?
Indeed, yes, that's the whole point. As you well know, British Israelism or
Right.
Anglo-Israelism is not only something that we find in Britain or Northern Europe or the United States, for instance. It is also something that, in different ways, you can find among other peoples in the people's groups in the world. And because of the very interesting origin and also not very understudied, let's say it that way,
That's a good word.
understudied origin of the gypsies, of the gypsy community, many of them feel very much at home with the idea that they might also be uh, part of the lost tribes of Israel,
Right.
which is
Right.
something I'm sure we'll talk about, and I guess that's the reason behind it.
Okay. That makes
And
sense. Yeah, we have the Hebrew Israelites here in
yeah,
America.
yes,
Sometimes Black Hebrew
right,
Israelites, but
right,
it's also a sort of a racial identity,
yes,
similar to what you're describing.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. I think
Yeah.
that probably explains at least part of it.
Sure. Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah. And then there's just sort of this global, I don't even know what I want to call it. I don't know if conspiracy theory is the right word, but there's this questioning of authority, and which is, that's okay. But there's these theories that get introduced, and you cover some of that here, the theologically that get introduced, but also there's historical sort of conspiracy theories, I'll call them. I'll call them unsubstantiated claims of history about this or that, about the separating of the Jews and the Gentiles, and what happened were the 10 tribes really lost and all that.
Mm,
And so
mm,
where we have, sort of holes in our knowledge historically, they will be filled
right, right.
sometimes with people that want to fill them with sort of interesting theories about
Mo-
things that, about,
most people I find that are very gullible, but
yeah,
they want to believe, and they when they find something, even if it's not substantiated, they so much want to believe in something that
Right.
they fall for it, and they feel that they have not been taken care of. They feel that traditional ways of expressing their faith have failed them. Even many of them would say, the church has lied to us. The church has hidden so many things from us,
I've heard that. Yeah.
and all of that really is the soil where all sorts of conspiracy theories can grow and grow, very, very rapidly.
Right.
So
Yeah.
one of my conclusions in the book is that really one way to explain the Hebrew roots movement is to say that it's a grand conspiracy theory, or to put it in another way, it's a string of different conspiracy theories.
Right.
Like the scribes who put down the Hebrew text, knowingly hid the name of the Lord so that we would not know what it was and we would not pronounce it. The church has hidden the Hebrew, what they say are the Hebrew original manuscripts that are
Right.
nowhere to be found, of course. But again, the conspiracy, they did it on purpose. They burned all the manuscripts so that we only have Greek manuscripts.
Yeah.
So and on and on and on. So it's a string of things that really are linked and have in common the fact that they are conspiracy theories.
Right. And it's exactly right. I mean, like you mentioned, we don't have the Hebrew manuscripts. So that lack of knowledge about where they are becomes this hole that they can fill with their theories. I actually have a quote that I posted on my YouTube channel from this book. You said this: ultimately, the Hebrew roots movement is a great conspiracy theory that is difficult to counter through the simple exposition of facts. I
Right.
thought that was a great way to put it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I've seen the same thing. So,
I mean, yeah. How can you face a conspiracy theory?
right.
We don't really know. I mean, because even if the plain truth is shown to somebody who wants to believe otherwise, yeah, they will resist any proof, any truth, and they will stay where they are. That's why it's so difficult to deal with some of the things that people in the Hebrew roots movement say or claim. And
Right.
not only difficult because I mean you can make a case against some of the nonsense that we read about and hear on social media, but at the end of the day, I mean, nothing changes because they will remain
Right.
unconvinced, and they will say that you've been brainwashed, and we've been there, done that. So what?
Right.
What
I
can
used to
you
think
tell
that
us
too, they'll say.
that we what can you
And
tell us that we don't know already?
right, exactly. And of course, when it's a conspiracy theory, then anything can be folded into it. Yeah.
Yes.
Now, here's an interesting question now. So you and I are agreed on that there is a conspiratorial element, but the folks who are in it, who are believing it from the inside, wouldn't call it that. They would call it newfound knowledge, or they would have a positive way to express that.
Yes.
How do you? I don't know how much you've interviewed or talked to folks with this, but how would you describe, or how would you? How do you try to pull the veil off and say, these things just aren't factual, or do you think there's a way to take trail of facts to the truth that might help lead them out?
Well, to tell you the truth, I think for many people it is impossible to hold any kind of conversation with many of the supporters, of the adherents of Hebrew roots. It just isn't possible to make a logical case, and that we can, both parties can agree on what truth is, on the law of non-contradiction and things like that, which are so basic in science and in humanities. You just cannot approach Hebrew roots this way, because they are just so closed in their in-house, they don't really. One of the problems with Hebrew roots is that it resembles, in some ways, many of the cults that we usually know. Not only recent cults, but even earlier cults. I hesitate when I'm asked, are Hebrew roots a cult? Well, I don't think Hebrew roots as such is a cult, but I do believe there are very many cultic or cultish attitudes among Hebrew rooters, if I may use that word.
Yeah, I've come to the same conclusion. I don't want to label it a cult. I don't know that it has all the markings.
Yeah,
but there are some things there that are really questionable. I get messages a lot, for example, from women whose husbands are in it.
Yes,
and it starts bordering on cult, even spiritual abuse, where the spouse is forcing or trying to have power and control over somebody else based on the word of God. And which is just heinous.
There are so many examples, of course, and in the book I talk about the jargon. I mean, all cults have their own jargon. Only members of the cult really understand what it's meant by certain code words. Mm-hmm. We have they cut ties with everybody else from the outside, so that they are not exposed to evil, to anything out there which may harm us and goes against us. They have this sense of being the victims, the victims of fraud, religious fraud, and traditions of man. I mean, church history for them is something they very much talk against.
Yeah, in a very real sense, they're rebuilding the dividing wall of hostility that Christ broke down, as Paul says in Ephesians 2. They're kind of reconstructing that. It's frustrating.
That's one way to put it, certainly. But also, I think that one of the problems is that when you go to the extremes, you're bound to get into trouble. I mean, one of the things that I did in my studies is to research one of the extremes within Christianity would be with regards to Judaism, would be what the so-called replacement theology, supersessionism, erasing the Jews from God's plan of salvation today. I mean, they had a place in the Old Testament, in the old times, but now that Jesus, the Messiah, has come, they have no purpose, no theological relevance. That would be one extreme. Now, Hebrew roots goes, in my view, to the opposite extreme, which is equally dangerous. They say, the church has preached and replacement theology. There's so much anti-Judaism, theological anti-Judaism in Christianity, throughout the ages. And we don't want that. We don't want that. But what they do is, by declaring themselves to be Israelites, to be Israel, in fact, they are falling into the same trap as replacement theology. So
Absolutely.
that we are just like them, they are like us, we are one, we are Israel, and therefore the Jewish people as such have, again, no particular interest or relevance theologically in the eyes of God, and so on. So
very true.
It's a battle of extremes, and that's a bad thing. That's a bad thing. But they don't realize, and this kind of reverse replacement theology, for want of a better word, this reverse replacement theology is also doing a lot of harm. So they accuse the Christian church of replacing the Jews, of not of doing away with the Old Testament, of not wanting to have anything to do with the Jewish people, and at the same time they're doing the same thing, only on the
Right.
other side of things.
Yeah. And like you said, I don't think they fully realize that.
No.
In fact, I think that's a good spot to jump into your book. So the book is called The Hebrew Roots Movement. I'll be honest, Ruben, I think I like the Spanish title better. What was called something, The Bitter Fruit?
Yes, it was a longer title. It was called The Bitter Fruits of the Hebrew Roots Movement.
Yeah, I love that. I thought that's great.
Yeah, because of course, I mean, our Lord said that you are to judge a tree by its fruits, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we have a movement like the Hebrew Roots Movement and we look at the fruits it's bearing, those fruits are horrible. I mean,
Bitter, yeah.
Division, bitter in all ways. There's
Absolutely.
division, there's criticism, backbiting, belittling brothers and sisters in the Lord, all sorts of things, and
I'll say the fruit of the Hebrew Roots Movement, I think, is one of the major indicators for people outside to know that something's wrong. And in all fairness, I have to say I have talked to, in the last maybe year or two, what I would call some reasonable Hebrew roots folks, where they're willing to have a friendly disagreement, and they'll acknowledge to some degree or another that this is not a salvific issue, although I do believe it ties directly to that. But so the just for our viewers, with the broad brushstroke we're painting, many of you who watch this are very familiar with this kind of behavior and those kinds of bitter fruits. And so I just kind of wanted to put that caveat out there that there are some genuinely kind folks in this arena, but in all honesty, in all candor, they're the minority.
Yes, they are.
Yeah. And so here's one thing I think is super interesting, and you did such a terrific job. You dove much deeper than I did into the roots of the Hebrew roots. So again, you guys, the book is called The Hebrew Roots Movement, A Critical Analysis of Its Origins, Teachings, and Biblical Interpretations. And Ruben just did a fantastic systematic job. So I wanted to chat a little bit about the forerunners of the Hebrew Roots Movement. You got a whole section on that, talking about the Worldwide Church of God, the Sacred Name Movement. My opinion is that most folks in Hebrew roots have no clue about the forerunners of the historical, more recent historical movement that began the calling that they're in, or the movement that they're in.
Right.
So can you kind of speak to that a little bit? That kind of the recent historical shift.
Sure. Just if I may, I just wanted to mention one thing about the reasons, the motivation behind the book. And that explains why I changed the title of the book. Even the content has changed a little bit, and of course it's an expanded edition as well, so it's got more material than the original version. But anyway, the subtitle of the book explains the three different points, or the different points that I'm trying to make as the basis of my research for the book. So first of all, I had a hermeneutical interest, that is interpretation.
Yeah, you got a beautiful section on that too.
Yeah. That from a hermeneutical point of view, I was interested in discovering how you can misinterpret the text of Scripture so blatantly, and at the same time get away with it. I mean, that to me was fascinating. I mean, how can the parable of the prodigal son be so misinterpreted in the Hebrew Roots Movement, for example? How can Acts 15:21 within the context of the Jerusalem Council be so misinterpreted as they want to say something that the text doesn't say. In fact, they want to say the opposite to what the text says. So I had a hermeneutical interest, but I also had a pastoral perspective, being a pastor myself.
Sure.
And I realized that something had to be done. And apart from a few chosen titles, there wasn't much literature to counter the errors of the Hebrew roots movement. And we all know that a growing number of Christians are being disturbed by their teachings worldwide, not only in a certain part of the world, which is a major concern. So that was the pastoral perspective. And thirdly, the theological approach. I wanted to show what I just said before, but I think that gives a context to the answer. I wanted to show how the two extremes of replacement theology on the one side and Hebrew roots on the other result in the same thing, the cancellation. Now that we talk so much about canceling people in our culture, the cancellation of the uniqueness of the Jewish people, the uniqueness of their election, the uniqueness of their calling, and so on and so forth. And in particular, because I found, and I do believe this, very much, that Hebrew roots undermines the very existence of Messianic Jews. And that, to me, is a grave problem.
Yes,
because
I agree.
I do believe in the place and the ministry of true Messianic Jews, and how they...
Yeah, and you have a section on that, I believe, right?
Right.
Yeah, where you're kind of
so I wanted,
differences.
in other words, that talks about interpretation, the title, the origins, the interpretation, the theological arguments, and therefore that was my main thrust when I decided to publish the book. So sorry for taking you on a tangent a little bit.
Oh, not at all. No, I think that's very interesting. I didn't actually catch that, but as you mentioned each part you addressed, I'm like, oh yeah, I read about that. Yeah,
and to me, because Messianic Judaism is not only one of my areas of research, it is very close to my heart as well. I'm a Gentile. I'm not a Jew, and I do believe it is very, very important to distinguish between Messianic Judaism on the one hand and Hebrew roots, because Hebrew roots, its origins, and that will take us to the forerunners, the origins of Hebrew roots and the doctrine, the main tenets of a Hebrew roots movement are completely different to Messianic Judaism.
Right.
But unless you know that and you dig in a little bit, for many people, they're probably just the same. They sort of lump together Messianics, the Messianic Church, the Messianic movement, Messianic Jews, Messianic Gentiles, but not everyone, not every word, every label means the same thing.
Right.
And that's what I try to explain in the book as well. I think it's very important.
That's good. Yeah. So I want to dig in on that a little bit.
We do not want to throw the baby with the bathwater.
Right. So I do want to spend a little time on the differences between Messianic Judaism and Hebrew roots. It's something I've delved into as well. But before we get there, I wanted to kind of dig in on some of these historical roots.
Yes.
Now that you've kind of set the table.
Yes, sorry.
So, no, not at all. It's all right. So do you go all the way back to, the 1800s, the Millerites, the Sabbatarian type movements, or where do you see the very earliest?
I don't do it in my book, although we could do it. I mean, historically, there are forerunners that go back at least a couple of 100 years, I would say.
Yeah, it becomes difficult to catch that first thread.
Right. But in my research, what I found really fascinating was when I began to deal with primary sources. Take, for instance, the Worldwide Church of God, Herbert Armstrong's group.
Yeah.
If you read their literature, it's so similar to what you can read online today that you would say, it's been penned by the same people. It's exactly the same way of couching arguments, exactly the same tenets, almost, exactly the same words. And that to me was quite a discovery. And I'm so sure that, Hebrew rooters don't have a clue that what they're saying today, their claims against Christian holidays, like Easter,
Yeah.
Christmas, and so on, that was done and written and rejected by Christianity many decades ago. So it's nothing new. I mean, the Hebrew roots movement is not a new phenomenon. It's
Right.
just it's a rehash of many of the doctrines that we can see in the worldwide Church of God, or for instance in the Sacred Name movement, which I mentioned.
So timeline-wise, the Church of God was 1920s, 1930s.
1930s,
is that right?
yes. And
okay, so it's 100 years ago.
Yeah, and so was the Sacred Name movement. Jacob Omeyer, the main figure perhaps in the Sacred Name movement, and before, slightly before, I would say, Herbert Armstrong. And you've got it all there. You have two-house theology.
Yeah.
In perhaps not exactly the same form that we find today, although there isn't a single two-house theology. There are different flavors, and one law theology. The Torah is meant for everyone, not just Jews, but everyone. All of that you can find in the worldwide Church of God, and their writings and their emphasis on Sabbath keeping, for example. I mean, Armstrong wrote, it's in the book with the references. Armstrong wrote that if you don't keep the Sabbath, you cannot possibly be saved. I mean, that's plainly what he said. And if you study Hebrew roots today, they are following the same argument. They don't come at you at the very beginning and tell you, you won't be saved. You won't be saved. They clothe it somehow and say, well, it would be better if you started to keep the Sabbath, because Sabbath is the day that we are commanded to keep as the people of God. And
they don't start with the full.
We are Israelites. I mean, we are not Christians. We are not Jews. We are not. We are Israelites because the Father has been calling us. We've heard His voice, and we were Gentiles among the nations because we had lost our identity. But now that we've answered that calling from the Father, God, Elohim, or Adonai, or different ways of addressing the Lord, that proves that we are truly descendants of the 10 lost tribes. I mean, Armstrong already said that so many years ago. He said, we are the descendants of the lost tribes. And he said, if you don't keep Sabbath, you will be lost. And he said and we said we must keep Passover and tabernacles and all the rest of it. And he said we need to eat kosher food. And so there's nothing new, basically, about the Hebrew roots movement. It's just something that every now and again in history emerges again, seems to have a revival, a comeback. But that's
it all goes back to the Judaizers, right? In Acts 15, and it's just rewarming. It's interesting. I was watching a video from a woman the other day. I think her name's Catherine, who was caught up in the Hebrew roots movement and left. And she said something. She had a great, and I hope I can have her on the show sometime. But she had a great analogy that describes what you just said.
The building, right?
It's the building, and you go in the. and isn't that so cultish? Where
It-
you go in the
it-
first
it-
floor and it looks nice and inviting,
because
and then yeah,
yeah. At first,
yeah. I mean,
they don't tell you what's behind.
no,
Just give you some, it's a bait.
right.
It's like a clickbait,
That's a very cult practice
Right.
of
You
yeah,
know, don't you think that if Jesus kept the Sabbath and went to the temple and the synagogue and on the Sabbath, don't you think that as disciples of Jesus we should be doing the same? And
right.
there you are. Just think about it, sort of thing.
It's a compelling argument because for folks that aren't real biblically literate, that they get in that gray area,
Mm, mm,
and it can become, well, yeah, it does say walk as Jesus walked, and it does say keep my commands. And
right.
wait, why would Jesus do that and we don't have to? And so there's a little bit of part of it's hermeneutics, which you touched on, and I want to get into in a second. Part of it is just the general lack of what I call just biblical literacy. It's just knowing the general flow of the new covenant, and not being. That's why like I'm going through a Bible study right now, but it's with an apologetics approach,
Right.
because I want to pull these things out that sometimes get people tripped up, and just look at what Scripture actually says. So let's talk a little bit about hermeneutics, because that's, I'm a fellow nerd and I love stuff like that. So you talk about, I forgot what you called it. Let's see. Oh, you call it Hebrish. I don't know if that's it. Yeah, but so yeah, just I guess speak generally about your thoughts on how do they, as you mentioned, come to these almost contrary conclusions about what the text is saying. Did you uncover a hermeneutical pattern?
Well, I think that it all has to do with the fact that progressive revelation is not something that they care too much about.
Right.
In other words, any text anywhere will mean what it means because we want it to mean that, and because we have adopted previously, in other words, our presuppositions are basically two house theology. There's the house of Israel, the northern tribes back in the day, which were lost after the Assyrians deported most of the population from Israel, from the northern tribes. So the two house would be the house of Israel, and then the house of Judah. So Jews today are descendants of the house of Judah, the southern tribes, basically Judah and Benjamin.
Benjamin, yeah,
and also the Levites, one might say.
Right.
Of course, there were many others, but they won't tell you that. So two house theology is very important. I mean, the worldwide Church of God also emphasizes two house theology, although they don't call it that. They talk about Anglo-Israelism.
Right.
So that's one leg, and the other one.
Okay, let me pause right there. I want to dig in just a little bit on that.
Okay.
So when you talk about the two house theology and the concept, which I hear all the time, that Jews mean they're from the tribe of Judah, rather than meaning that they're descendants of the 12 tribes of Israel.
Right. I mean,
so are you suggesting that they begin with that presupposition that Jews only refers to the southern kingdom, and then every time they look through the New Testament and see the word Jew, that's the confirmation or the presupposition that they're bringing to the text?
Right. I mean, obviously, if you read the Bible, just read, and then, of course, interpret the Bible in its own context, and interpret one text through the other texts in the scriptures, you won't find that idea. You won't find two house theology. So you don't derive it from the text. You don't do exegesis. You do eisegesis. You put it into the text, and then you find it again and say, I found it. But you found it because you put it there. It wasn't there. It's not there. And the same happens because let's see, there are so many things to talk about.
I know. Yeah.
I mean, we know that the term Jew after Judah returned from Babylon, from Persia at the time, after the exile. We know that from that time onwards, Israelite, Hebrew, or Jew basically were used synonymously. They meant the same thing. They refer to the people of Israel.
Right.
And that's what we see also in the New Testament. I mean, Peter, Paul, all the apostles talk about Israelites, Hebrews, Jews, people of Israel, you name it. They all mean the same. There are no distinctions between tribes and the north and south and two-house theology. There's no hint of that.
Yeah, I think isn't it James, I think, even mentions the 12 tribes. I think it's his book in the Salutation.
Yeah. And so they were never lost. In other words, they were never lost. They were never
right, yeah. And you can't. There's some passages in the New Testament where if you read the word Jew as referring to only descendants of the Southern Kingdom, it makes the passage nonsensical.
That's right. That's right. And also, you see, when since they understand that Gentile really doesn't mean Gentile, it means Israelite, somebody from the northern tribes, a descendant of the northern tribes, not the 12, the 10 northern tribes.
Right.
Even when Paul talks about Gentiles and Jews, what they understand is that it's saying there that the tribes from the north and the tribes from the south, in other words, the Israelites and the Jews, have become one or will become one. They don't take Gentile as a non-Jew, which is the clear meaning of the word most of the time. And that there are two lexical studies, short ones, in my book, two appendices, one on Gentiles, on the meaning of Gentile, and another one on the meaning of Torah, because of course we all use the same words, but we mean vastly different things.
Right.
And unless
that also is a red flag of a cultish type mentality of redefining common words.
And but of course, I mean, what can you expect from someone who uses Strong's Concordance, Strong's lexicon at the back of the original concordance to define, what the Bible says across the board, not just in one passage or another, and they apply all the possible meanings of the word to each instance that the word is found in the Bible. I mean, that's a fallacy that we all know.
Yeah.
Those who have been, trained, even basically trained in hermeneutics know that. I mean, cannot, a word means what it means based on the context. It cannot mean everything that it can mean in every single instance, that you find a word in.
That's the semantic range fallacy. You learn about that in your first semester of hermeneutics.
Yes, it's pretty basic, really. But as I said, sometime at the beginning, they won't pay attention to that. They will stick to their Strong's Concordance or even lexicon, and they won't understand, that there are so many tools that we have at our disposal today. And anybody who's done any study on the subject knows that Gentile most of the time means simply non-Jew. It is not a moral label. It's not a spiritual label. It's just a way of defining all the nations that are not Israel. There's the chosen people, and then there's the nations, Israel and the nations. So,
and even Paul sometimes says the Greeks as a stand-in for Gentiles or for non-Jews. Yes.
But of course, when Paul himself talks about Jews and Gentiles, as I said, Hebrew roots understands that it's talking about Gentiles who are now not Gentiles any longer. In other words, they were Gentiles, but now they've recovered their identity. They are now Israelites, and they are the brothers and sisters of Judah, of the Jews. So there's the Jewish people on the one hand, and then there's the Israelites on the other, the former Gentiles. Because for Hebrew roots, for the Hebrew roots movement, it seems to me that the main problem they have is that for them, salvation really means that a Gentile is not a Gentile anymore. I mean, you cannot possibly be a Gentile, because they take Gentile as a dirty word, as meaning idolater, pagan, all the nice things they say about Christians, traditional Christianity, for instance. You know,
right? I hear that a lot.
Right,
and I'll point them to Revelation 7. You know, where it says people from every tribe and nation and tongue were gathered, just after it listed the 12 tribes of Israel. That people of every tribe and nation and tongue are circling the throne and worshiping the Lord, and that's a picture not of some collapsed people group. That's a picture of the entire earth in their God-given ethnicities and backgrounds and ancestries, worshiping the Lord, and that's what heaven looks like. You know? So it's not getting rid of the Jews, and it's not getting rid of the Gentiles.
So coming back,
both are required, right?
Right. And coming back to your question, what I find, the pattern I find is the use they make of biblical vocabulary is just wrong. I mean, they put in meanings that are not there when they are not there, and therefore it is almost impossible to hold an intelligent conversation, an exegetical kind of discussion. What does this passage mean? I mean, why does it say what it says? How can we possibly understand it and apply it? And therefore, that's the main problem. If you cannot do any hermeneutical work unless you define your terms.
Yeah, and that's very true. And I see that a lot. And you end up talking past one another, and you're not sure why. It took me a while to.
One of the figures in the book, somebody's talking to the other, but really passing one another. They're not engaging in conversation.
Yeah, and that becomes frustrating, especially if.
Sorry.
I was going to say, when you have that in an interfamily relationship or an intercommunity relationship, where suddenly this person, that maybe it's your spouse, maybe it's a good friend from church, suddenly you guys can't seem to even see eye to eye, becomes very frustrating. I hear from folks a lot about that.
Yes, because we are talking about key words. I mean, which goes back to the Hebrewish thing, They say words like faith, like truth, like gospel, and of course proper names like Jesus, like God, words like salvation, even Gentile, Torah. So many key words, key terms are redefined in a way that suits the arguments of the Hebrew roots movement.
Oh gosh, it's so
sometimes it can be subtle, but other times it's just playing in view inside.
And they don't see it.
Inconceivable that we should be talking about the meaning of certain things that we can't even agree on. So therefore, when they talk about Torah, of course, as you well know, they talk almost 100% of the time about the law of Moses, but that's not the way Torah is used in the Bible. In the Old Testament as Torah, or even nomos in the New Testament, and of course in the New Testament we have two different words: nomos for law in general, and entole, which is used for commandments. And although we may think that it's pretty clear and straightforward, the meaning of each one of these words, we use them differently, and therefore the misunderstandings and the hermeneutical problems come in at least partly from that, and
Right.
partly,
No, yeah, they
and
absolutely
partly
do. Yeah.
from the presuppositions that we all have. We all have our lenses,
Yeah.
and when we come to the Bible, but the difference is, if you acknowledge that you have those lenses, your presuppositions, you acknowledge those presuppositions, you can be, because all of us have presuppositions.
Right. Yeah. It's just being aware of them.
It's just being human. That's the nature of things.
Right.
We all have them. But if you realize you have them, you are in a position to really come to grips with the meaning of the text. When
Right.
you don't recognize, when you don't acknowledge any lenses, when you say, "Oh no, I'm just reading the Bible. I mean, this is the plain reading, the plain sense." I mean, no, it is not.
Right. Reading
Back
is
to
interpretation. Yeah.
Acts 15:21. It doesn't say there that Gentiles who have been clearly told that they do not need to keep Torah in order to become members of the Messianic assembly. It doesn't say there that they will go to the synagogue and after what you call the starter pack
Starter pack. Yeah.
of commands to the churches, to the Gentile churches. It doesn't say they will go to the synagogue and they will learn all Torah and they will become fully Torah observant in due course. It doesn't say that. And there are many other ways to interpret that text, but they don't care. They don't care.
But the New Testament nowhere says that should or did happen either.
No.
So it's not just the local context that they're missing.
Right. Because the context is the whole of Scripture. And if you cannot base your doctrine on one passage or two passages and disregard the whole context of Scripture. I mean, biblical theology is what it's all about. We take not systematic theology, which would be a step further. Biblical theology. I mean, what do the different books of the Bible tell us about God, about redemption, about Israel, about this, about that? So
if you miss that, like you said before, progressive revelation, you also miss. And so you don't see the unfolding of God's story through history.
Right.
If you think that everything I read applies to everybody all at once,
so
you're missing it.
Did Jesus go to the synagogues on Sabbath? Of course he did. He was a Jew.
Yeah.
But we are not.
Right.
And 99.9% of Hebrew roots movement are not Jews.
So, I would say 100%. But yeah.
Probably. So, I mean, we were never told, as nations of the world, we were never told, we were never given, rather than told, we were never given the Torah. The Torah was given to Israel on Mount Sinai because that was part of the covenant, that the Torah as instruction, as teaching, Torah can be understood as the different stipulations that God gives his chosen people after he has entered into a covenant with them.
Right.
I mean, Torah always comes with the covenant. You have a covenant and you have its laws. You have
it's the terms.
Its statutes, its terms. That's what the Mosaic law is. And that was for them, and that was for that time. But when the covenant, as we know, changes, not that everything that came before is done away with. That we don't say that. The Bible doesn't say that. But there's definitely there's a continuity over time. But there's also discontinuity. And when Jesus comes, the Son of God, the Messiah, the God of Israel, has manifested himself in his Son coming to this world I mean, that must mean something. If nothing
Right.
changes with respect to the way we were doing things earlier or before, if nothing changes, then something's wrong. Something's
Then
never
why did he
wrong.
come? Yeah.
Yeah, why did he come? For Hebrew rooters, Jesus becomes a guru, becomes a teacher, becomes
That points us back to
a
Torah.
role
Right.
model, telling us, this is how you keep Torah.
Yep. Yeah. Okay, so let me ask you this. In your research and studying, did you come across any particular passages that were very commonly used as like a proof text for Hebrew roots?
Well, yes, and probably certainly both of us, and probably most of the people who are listening to our conversation know them. I mean, there are texts that are used to stress the continuity between what we call, I'm not happy with that, but what we usually call the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Sure.
The Old Covenant and the Old Covenant and the New one. And of course, there are passages like that. But when you take into account the whole of Scripture, the whole tenor of the Bible, you realize that something drastically changed when Jesus came. So when does the new covenant really start? I think that when we look at the Gospels, we see that up until the time when Jesus is led to when he goes to the cross, goes to Calvary and dies on the cross, and when he says, "It is finished," the telestai. I mean, that's when, with his death, that's when the new covenant begins.
Yeah.
I mean,
and Luke 22, he says, the new covenant is in my blood.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's when he says, "This is my new covenant," in my blood, the wine, the bread, my body. That foreshadows when in fact he gives himself, gives
Right.
it all for us, and dies on our behalf, and that's when the new covenant starts. So, did Jesus go to the synagogue? Did he keep Sabbath? Did he keep Torah? Roughly. Well, he did. He was a Jew, and so were the disciples, and so were most of the first followers of of Jesus. But we are not. And
that's an important distinction.
And the distinction between Jew and non-Jew still applies even after Christ has come to the world.
Right.
And the proof is that the Apostle Paul calls himself, "I'm the apostle to the Gentiles." And he's talking to people who are already believers.
And he says he's a Hebrew of Hebrews, right? He's a Pharisee. He lists his bona fides as a Jewish man and says, "I am the apostle to the Gentiles." So yeah, absolutely.
And unity in the church, in the body of Messiah, is a unity of distinct people.
Right. I always say it's a unity, but not a uniformity.
Right. And when Paul says, excuse me, when Paul says there is no male nor female, Greek or Jew or Gentile, and so on and so forth, for salvation purposes, of course, there's no distinction between, all humans are humans and are saved by the Lord, by the redemption work on the cross. But within the church, women are still women, men are still men, servants are still servants, as we see in the epistles. Jews are Jews, and non-Jews are non-Jews. And salvation doesn't mean that a Gentile turns into a Jew, or that a Jew becomes a Gentile. I mean, that's what they don't seem to understand.
Right. Otherwise, we would have to say men and women become each other, which is maybe a little too scary to modern headlines. But Okay, I want to be respectful of your time here. I do have one other question, and then I want to chat a little bit about how people can get in touch with you. But so we are in the middle of Easter season. This Sunday is Easter.
Yeah.
I get constantly, and you may have seen kind of every year around this time, I constantly am confronted with these ideas that Easter comes from Ishtar, or these crazy theories, even though the English word Easter didn't even exist back. Anyway, here's my question for you. Two-part question. Part one is, in Spain, what do they call Easter?
They call it Pascua, which comes from Pascha, which from Passover, not from Easter.
Right. So Easter has nothing to do. I think in most of Europe,
nothing whatsoever to do with it.
It's not. I'm even fine. Let's call it something else.
There you have another conspiracy theory.
Right.
I mean, Nicaea, the Council of Nicaea did it all wrong, and they on purpose, took the Bible out of our hands and then decided which books made it in, which books not. They, Constantine, of course, the great villain of the story, decided. Well, he didn't decide anything. I mean, the emperor just convened the meeting, but the meeting was a church meeting. It wasn't anything else.
It was about the Arian controversy. Yeah,
right.
So here's my second part of my Easter question. So you probably then don't get that particular line of argument about the word Easter meaning something else. But what line of argument would you hear in Spain or Europe in general against Easter?
The line of argument would be more, the one that goes back to Rome, Babylon, Egypt, which is pretty universal anyway, not just here in Spain. In other words, Christianity has deviated so much from from the course it should have followed, because it renounced, it denied its identity, its Hebrew roots, and so on, and it's become a pagan religion, tradition of men.
Right. And so how do you typically respond to that line of argument?
Well, it's nonsensical. I mean, atheists, for instance, have in the past used to use the same line of argument to talk about, recalling the so-called pagan background or heathen background of festivities and things like that. But of course, then they realized what anthropologists and sociologists and so many people, historians, archaeologists, and so many people have told us ever since. There are many customs. There are many days in the lunar year or solar year, whatever, that we find in different civilizations, and which we have today, which do not preserve any of the meanings that those days and celebrations and customs and rites had 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. I mean, take circumcision, for instance. The Jews, the Hebrew people, did not invent circumcision. Circumcision predates Israel, predates Abraham, and it was practiced by pagans. Now, does that mean that circumcision is a pagan rite and that the people of Israel are pagans because they practice circumcision? Of course not.
Right.
Of course not. I mean, is it externally similar? Yes, it is. Does it mean the same? No, it doesn't.
No, exactly.
Not at all. And so we have that throughout history, and we have so many examples. I mean, do you really think that any Christian in the world on Monday, on Sunday, this coming Sunday, will be worshiping the sun? Do you really believe that any Christian will be worshiping, I don't know, the cycle of death and resurrection and life? Of course not. I mean,
and conversely, there's no pagans on Sunday who will suddenly worship the risen Christ.
Right, right.
These are totally different. Yeah, I
and,
agree.
And meaning gets re-signified. In other words, interestingly enough, I recall one Messianic Jew, an author, who said something like this: the meaning of something is not determined by its origins. It is determined by the people who make use of a certain rite, custom, festival, or whatever. In other words,
great point.
So, in other words, is Christmas? Do we celebrate Christmas on the 25th of December? Yes, we do. Does it have anything to do with pagan customs that took place on the 25th of December? Of course not. Does it mean the same? No. It means what Christians decide that it means. We today determine the meaning of things, not the origin. Because if it were the origin that determined the meaning, then everything would be pagan, because everybody somehow, back in wherever and whenever has been doing things this way. So are we going to say we don't do anything because it's pagan, or it comes from Mesopotamia or Africa or wherever?
That's a great point.
Let me give you just a short example. The law of Moses is strikingly similar in many ways to the code of Hammurabi.
Right.
The King Hammurabi, who lived, of course, much earlier than Moses, after his name was written a code that has many of the casuistic, particularly the case laws that we find in the Pentateuch. I mean, does that mean that at every time the law of Moses says something remotely similar or very similar to Hammurabi's code, does it mean that it's pagan? Does it mean that we shouldn't do it?
Right.
Obviously not.
Well, and so here's the case in point for that. God called Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldeans and brought him to a land and began a people.
Yes.
So it wasn't God took him out of pagan areas,
right,
and set him apart and made him holy as the beginning of the faith, right? And you see things like the temple that Solomon built is built with the labor and materials from the pagan nations around them, right? And the names of the Hebrew months in Hebrew come from Babylonia. So you're exactly right. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it. So
and how else could God reveal himself if not through the culture of the time?
Yeah.
That's
the beauty of our faith. It's so historic.
And that for me is one very powerful argument against Hebrew roots. I mean, we do not have to be Hebrews to understand what God wants us to do, what God wants from us, what the good news is. We do not have to be Hebrews. We do not have to speak the language. We do not have to have the so-called Hebrew mindset. No, because languages can be, I'm a professional translator. Languages can and do get translated into different languages, and although they are different languages, the ideas conveyed are the same.
Right.
To say that language determines our mindset is something that linguists today will deny. I mean, language can express our mindset, our mentality, language is important for our mindset, our worldview, the way we understand things around us,
Yep.
but it does not determine it. And God, when he reveals himself, has to reveal himself within a culture. He cannot reveal himself in a vacuum. He needs to reveal himself within the context of a culture.
And it's not because he's limited, it's because he has to dumb it down for the humans that need to understand. The receiver of the communication,
How else could the Hebrews understand Moses' law, the law of Moses, the stipulations, if it were not couched in a very similar language and mindset as the laws of Hammurabi, for example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now,
but what's interesting
you wouldn't expect now, today, in the 21st century, you wouldn't expect God to talk to us in those particular cultural, ways. He does speak to us in a different way through the same word, because
it's even like it's bigger than that too. Because if you go back to God's promise to Abraham that in him all the nations of the earth would be blessed, God knew even long before the law was given at Sinai, it already wasn't attached to a single language. The gospel for the world, you know what I mean? When you go and make disciples of all nations, right?
The gospel, or if you want, I use the term the God's principles. Going back to, I think it's your term, the principles and the practical application of divine principles. God's principles do not change. What changes is the application in one particular time, at one particular moment in history. And so God's revelation is not linked to a language, to a culture.
Yeah. Wow, that's some great insight. I love that you've got even the professional background of translating that gives us that whole extra layer of understanding.
Otherwise, how, if you write a book, how can I convey that to a Spanish-speaking audience if it's impossible? Because for Hebrew roots, unless it's Hebrew, it's just evil. It's pagan. It's useless. But no, it's not. I mean, the church, the New Testament church, had their Bible in Greek. That it was the Septuagint. It wasn't the Hebrew text for most cases.
Right. Yeah,
so,
that's.
I mean, as a translator, it just makes me feel bad when I hear that people say, "Well, unless you know Hebrew, you don't know what faith is. You don't know what Gentile is, or Goim, or you don't know what," and things like that. I mean, of course I do know, because there's a Greek term and a Latin term and a Spanish term and an English term that means the same.
It means the same. Yeah, exactly.
And then you and I and others and preachers and teachers and so on have to be mediators, cultural mediators, to our people today.
Contextualize it,
contextualize the text and the revelation.
So let's talk about this book a little bit, because this is the stuff that you're hearing from Ruben. Is a lot of that's captured in here, and it's amazing. Where can someone get this? Especially, is it available in America?
Oh yeah, of course. It's available everywhere in the world through Amazon.
Okay, beautiful.
So paperback and Kindle.
Okay, perfect. I was going to see if it's hardcover. I want a copy of that. But
no, there's no.
Not yet. Okay. So this is the Hebrew Roots Movement from our author, Rubén Goméz. And again, guys, I wrote the foreword for it, and I wasn't joking when I said that this is, I believe, one of the most comprehensive and systematic kind of breakdowns of this faith tradition, cult, whatever you want to call it, this movement. And so if you're dealing with that in your churches, in your families, in your friend groups, and you wanted to understand more, I would highly recommend this book. He talks about a lot of things that aren't covered in my book, which I really appreciated. So as I was reading it in preparation to write the foreword, I learned so much stuff I didn't already know. So thank you so much for this effort, Ruben. It's incredible.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for spending some time with us. I'd love to have you on again at some point.
My pleasure.
All right. Thanks everybody for watching. Shalom.